Today we're beginning a new series, a new study on love. If you can't get excited about love, then you can't get excited about anything in the New Testament, I think, in the Gospel. Jesus talked about love as being the key principle of the New Testament. The one thing that God wanted from us all, that if we had it, we had everything, and if we lost it, we had nothing. And it was Jesus' first and second commands for his disciples, right? Love God, love each other. And I realized I was putting this message together that it's the first time I've ever preached a series of sermons on love, at least I think that it is, and I'm most excited about preaching as I've ever been, and a little bit nervous because I wonder, can I do it justice? It's such an important subject for who we are and what we're all about as Christians. So whatever we talk about on Sunday mornings, if we don't get around to talking about love, then we've missed the biggest point of the New Testament. We've missed the meaning of the good news. We've missed the Father's forgiveness. We've missed what fills people's hearts and makes life worth living. If you want to know the value of love, just ask someone who doesn't have it. Look around you and you'll see a lot of places. You go on the internet and you can read posts on Facebook. I was reading some posts on Facebook this past week from some people whom I knew who were sad because they didn't have a special someone in their lives. Read the sites that will help you to find a partner. The illusions that people seek in sexuality. There's big money in eHarmony.com and a lot of other sites, and they know how to advertise their product. If a person doesn't have love, they're looking for love. They're seeking for it. They're looking for illusions of it. I have a friend who's used those sites, and she's looked to friends who have introduced her to other friends to set her up and get her into relationships. And everything's worked out badly. And she comes back and she's sad because she's still without love. So people seek the illusion of love if they don't have it even. They would kill for it, and some do kill for it, thinking that somehow they could have love that way, and they can't. They lie for it, and they lose it, and they cry over its loss when they think that they're no longer loved. And I believe that as much as anything, you and me are at least partially responsible for people feeling that way. Maybe a little bit of an odd comment to make. But when people feel unloved, there are people around them who aren't showing them love as well as they need it. Part of what I believe there. God's commands start with this big command to love one another, because He knows that we won't do enough of it without being told. We'll give up on people. We will be hurt, and we won't want to go on hurting. Love takes a huge amount of effort and dedication, sometimes for people who don't deserve to be loved. And the truth that's told in the Bible is that none of us really deserves to be loved. Because we all act ridiculous, hateful, foolish at times. We drive away the people who would care for us. The miracle of God is that He loves us anyway. Let's begin our study with love today with 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul defines love. We're going to be starting a lot of the sermons in 1 Corinthians 13. And we're going to start with verse 1 today. It's an odd place to start in some ways because everybody talks about this being the love chapter. But really it falls in a context, and so we're going to get there in just a moment. Let's read verses 1 through 3, where Paul says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all of my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. The first thing you have to notice as you read what Paul says here about what doesn't get you there, what isn't as good as love, he starts this chapter off with speaking in tongues. If I can speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but don't have love, I'm just a bunch of noise. Why the interest in speaking in tongues? He talks as well about prophecy, faith, generosity, self-sacrifice. And he talks about those things as being of no value without love. In chapter 12, Paul addressed his concerns about spiritual gifts, particularly speaking in tongues, but also faith, healing, knowledge, miracles, and prophecy. You should have seen a lot of the same words crop up there that we just read in verses 1 through 3. People in the church were competing over spiritual gifts. They were bragging about having the best ones or being the most impressive. And so Paul was concerned about their priorities being all wrong. He didn't choose his words haphazardly when he said if he could speak in the tongues of men and angels but didn't have love, he was just a noisy gong. He was talking to members of that church who were babbling in ecstatic languages, as he refers to in chapters 12 and 14. Members of the church were imitating the pagan goddess or the pagan priestesses in the temples nearby, who would do this ecstatic utterance. And the Corinthians saw it and thought it was impressive, and so they imitated what they thought was impressive and spiritual and full of deep meaning. And even as useful and important as it was to speak in tongues, it had a purpose. Paul said he was glad that he could speak in tongues more than them all, because he would go around spreading the gospel. Paul was able to speak Greek, so there was no real reason for him to speak in other languages when talking to the Corinthians, right? He could speak in Greek. His words were intelligible, as he says they should be in chapter 14. And that gift was given to him to be able to spread the good news to people, to many of the apostles, so they could talk to people who didn't otherwise understand what the preacher was saying. And so even as useful and important as it was to speak in tongues, Paul states that without love, it would just be noisy. It was a gift from God. So it wasn't so far it was so far distant in importance, though, from love, that it would just be noise by itself. You know, I look around at churches today, and in comparison, it kind of brings me to mind when I think about that scripture. I think about all the musical programs that you see in churches. There's nothing wrong with music, I don't think, as far as people having praise from their heart. We sit here, we sing our hearts out, and that's a good thing as we open up our books and we sing from our hearts to God and we praise Him with our voices. But you look around, a lot of churches have these big musical programs, beautiful choirs, angelic voices, and I think about what Paul says here. You could have all the tongues of the angels. You could have the greatest presentation ever. You can have the greatest abilities to do things, but if you don't have love, you've missed the whole boat. And sometimes when people get all caught up in the external stuff, they forget or miss the key important stuff that the gospel focuses on. He then talks about prophecy, and knowledge, and faith. And those are important gifts. In chapter 14, Paul says prophecy is more important than speaking in tongues. He tells them, seek the gift of prophecy. Particularly. Seek to be able to speak for God, to know what you know about what the Lord wants, and to share it with other people. That's what I believe he's talking about there in the context. Jesus taught about the importance of faith. You need faith to be right with God. He talks about faith in here as well. But without love, even the most significant gifts that we could obtain are worthless. And I think that churches mess up this truth all the time. We do exactly what the Corinthians did. We get all caught up in arguments about instrumental music, praise teams, buildings, committees, all the things that last week we did the little skit up front here to show the sorts of things that churches of Christ have divided over. And we completely lose sight of love when we get all caught up in these particular little things the Bible doesn't even talk about. We divide like the Corinthians, or we accuse each other of being unbiblical, or we act in a way like people who don't possess the Spirit of God that He's given to us. Love ceases to be a doctrine of its own, while we focus on a lot of other things that are also doctrines. And if Paul could write this verse today, I kind of put together what I think he would write. I believe he might say, if I could figure out all the perfect doctrines and match the first century church, but don't have love, then I have a meaningless gathering of people. And that's something I believe to be true. If you get every doctrine right and you forget about love, you've wasted your time. Love is what we were created for. It isn't easy to do. It's not just done sometimes, but all the time. And it takes work, especially when you disagree with the people whom you claim to love. Do you throw your children out of the house because they make a mistake or don't agree with you? You might throw them out if they do something hideous in your house. It won't stop if you confronted them. But even then, we'd probably be patient. We'd get therapy for them maybe. We'd ask them to change. We'd help them. We'd want to bring them back to being part of the family, which is what a church should be all about. It's what families should be. It's the way neighbors and friends should be, wanting to heal what's broken. Just being right about everything is not your purpose in life. You can be 100% right about every doctrine and fail to understand the Father's most important rule. Love one another. And none of those other doctrines then would mean anything if you didn't have love. Now, I've known families that have allowed their children to disobey the rules without consequences, and I'm not saying love does that. Discipline can help a child to learn and grow, and it's part of love. And when it's done in a loving way and not overdone, not every offense needs to be punished, and punished harshly, certainly, as sometimes people feel like they need to do. Children, all of us, we make mistakes. We need to be able to learn and grow from them. And love teaches us the difference between punishing to make things even and guiding and redirecting to help someone become better and help them to heal. Paul also talks about faith. People who have faith that Jesus spoke of. The kind of faith that could move a mountain. The enormous, amazing faith that Jesus says you should have. Jesus tells you, people, God tells us, if we were to follow Him, we have to have faith. We have to believe that He exists. We have to trust in Him. But even that much faith, Paul says, being tops in it, would be no value without love. And then he talks about generosity. I hear some people talk about Jesus' words, the rich ruler, and they suggest if you give generously, if you are overwhelmingly generous, well, that's a form of love, right? You share your things with people around you. Seems like a loving thing to do. And yet Paul says if he gives all of his possessions to the poor and doesn't have love, profits him nothing. How could you do that? Well, a lot of people give things to the poor, right? Because they want to earn their salvation, maybe. They want God to let them into heaven. Maybe they give all their possessions to try to make themselves feel better. Your motives matter to God. How do you really care about the people around you? Not just the people who are far off, poor. How do you love the people you're near to? your friends, your family, your neighbors, the bad neighbors. Finally, Paul's last example is of someone who surrenders his body to be burned. I think he's talking about martyrdom there, right? He's got people in the church, in the first century church, who lost their lives for their faith. We know that Paul was stoned on a couple of occasions, survived it. Paul stood there while Stephen was stoned. There are stories later on of Christian men who were burned at the stake. We had Nero, an early emperor, and then Domitian, who came along and cruelly punished Christians just for their faith. It would seem that a person who died for their faith like that you'd be a shoo-in for heaven, right? I mean, wouldn't you like to think, I died for God? Surely I'm going to heaven. And Paul uses this as an example. He says, even if I gave over my body to be burned, if I failed to have love, I just wasted it. Wasted my life. It profits me nothing. Some Muslims make a real point of it, right? They say that you can have any offenses wiped away. You just obey the command to die for the cause. But Paul says it doesn't work that way. Without love, dying is just dying. God made you for a purpose, and the greatest purpose is love. Let's turn over to 1 John, chapter 4, where the writer John, who was known to preach on love a lot, frequently, he says in verse 7 of 1 John 4, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who is born of God and knows God, the one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. You know, to be a Christian, to be born again, you've got to embrace love. If you don't want love, you don't want God. If you don't want to become a more loving person, you don't understand the God you're trying to get into a relationship with. The God who loved hurtful, mean people, that's you and me in Romans in certain places, Romans 5. The enemies of God, God loved those people, us, enough to send his son to die on the cross to fix things for us. That's love, John says. That Christ died for us. At the end of time, that's all that's going to matter. It's all that's going to remain. We're not going to have church buildings, I don't believe, in heaven. I don't know, I might be wrong there. But we won't be worried about a lot of the same particulars about who does what and how. We'll be concerned about each other more. And that process, that concern, starts now. It's part of the training that we're living through now. And for the next several weeks, we're going to go into the details of Paul's definition of love. We're going to take a look at each one of those descriptions that he has and explore his definition and how to put it into practice. It's something we all need to be right about. Something we all need to get down perfectly, as well as we can, to love one another.